Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Pitre, as you heard before. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And actually, it's a great sort of segue both from Paul and Milton in terms of what we're here to talk about. About a year ago, a group of us put together a symposium. We called it CAFE, which was the community assets for everyone. And some of you actually might have joined us. And we had a symposium where we talked about community hubs. And we said, why is it that we have local heroes that can do this on the ground, but it's not more systemic in what we're doing? And we found actually that we have a lot of common elements. And the one thing that came out of that day-long session, actually it was unfortunate, it was the same day as budget day. So we had a whole bunch of people from the province who were supposed to be there, but they got consumed by the budget. But we did a report at the end of that, and we said the number one thing that people agreed on as to why we are sort of having pockets of people that can do this, and it's usually the work of local heroes, like most of the people probably in this room, is that there's a lack of leadership at the provincial level. So we took that, and I have worked with the Premier when she was actually the Minister of Education, and we'd done some projects trying to sort out some of the real estate in Toronto, which I'm sure you can appreciate is never easy with our school boards. And I went back to her and I said, you know, this is something that you've been interested in for your whole political life, and now you're the Premier. And the one thing that everyone says is missing in this conversation is the fact that there's a lack of leadership at the provincial level. And she said, okay, if there's a lack of leadership, I'm going to lead. So she asked me to figure out what it would take to actually, basically I call it move the mothership, to actually make this something that the province could actually support. So it was the Friday of March break, and the Premier actually, the announcement went out that I would be the special advisor on community hubs, and I thought that's perfect. It's kind of, I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing yet, so it's kind of below the radar. Nobody will pay much attention, and I just got everybody landed on my head. It was a remarkable thing. They found me from everywhere, and I thought, wow, this is incredible. We've clearly tapped into something, because there had been no single point of contact to talk about what is a community hub. And they found me from everywhere, and that was health and education and libraries and legal aid and community courts, and just this incredible cross-section of people that wanted to talk about community hubs. And we also the Premier has also given 6 ministers mandate letters. And within those mandate letters, when they became the minister, she said, we want you to work on community hubs. So that's the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, that's the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, seniors, and they all have this in their mandate letters. But again, they were sort of continuing to work away, as everybody does, with their head down in their silos. And until my name sort of came up, and then we've basically got a cabinet secretariat that actually is working out of cabinet office to organize the work that's being done in the various ministries. They got bombarded by people who wanted to talk about community hubs. So we have a few people here from cabinet office, but the team is growing because this is a conversation that actually is continuing to expand, and we're trying to figure out what exactly that looks like. I think the other thing is that it's a very interesting conversation because it means something different to everybody else. And everybody says to me, well, could you define a community hub? And I said, actually, no. We're deliberately not defining a community hub, because you define the community hub. So what you need in your community is however you describe the services that are required in your community hub. We don't want to interfere with that process. You know what's needed on the ground. You know who delivers those services. You know what's needed and how to do that. What we're trying to figure out is, once you've got that sorted out, what does that mean as a point of intersection with the province? So that could mean a physical space. Schools tend to come to people's minds. We've actually, one of the things we talked about at the beginning was, I'm not the special advisor to the Ministry of Education. I'm the special advisor to the Premier, because we said that the Ministry of Education actually can't solve this. And we need to look at this with a much bigger lens in terms of what this looks like. I didn't really realize how big the lens would be, to be honest. When I met with a number of the deputy ministers, and there's 23 of them, and we said we have 6 ministers that have this in their mandate letter, all the deputies said, almost every one of them said, but I have an impact on a community hub in somewhere in the work that I'm doing. That could be, well, Ministry of Children's Services clearly said that. There's other ones like Rural Affairs that says this has a huge impact on what we're talking about. So we're trying to figure out how to piece that together. And the Premier was actually really clear. She said, and as you can probably appreciate the Premier, she said, could you do this in 30 days? And I said, could you give me a little more of a window here? But she's very interested in sort of the commitment that I've given her is that we're going to put together a roadmap by the end of June. And we're now counting days, not months. But basically what she said to me was, we've been talking about this for 20 years. People have been doing this for longer. Why is it, or what is it that we need to do at the province to make this easier for municipalities, service providers, everybody on the ground that actually can make this much more organic and easier? And there's things that the province does that we need to change in order to do that. You need to tell me what those are. So what I've done is I've actually turned it around, and people said, we've come here to listen. I said, no, actually, I'm here to actually hear what you have to say, because we don't know exactly what that means in terms of what's required from the provincial level. But we do know that we've heard, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we've heard, because it's an interesting conversation which probably a lot of you can relate to. We have heard that some service providers will have 17 different funding streams that all come from the province, some of which come from the Ministry of Health, and there may be 4 different grants within that process, all of which have different reporting requirements, different financial times that they have to be done, and different ways of measuring whether they've been successful or not. We think that's a problem. Now, we've identified that. What we're doing now is we're sort of reflecting on what people have told us, and actually it's kind of staggering at times what people tell us in terms of things that maybe perhaps aren't working perfectly, that being one of them. So what we're doing is we're trying to take that under advisement and say, okay, so how do we change that so actually we can have a similar reporting framework? We can actually time them so that you actually have to deliver them at the same time. So to try and ease up, I mean, this one organization said they have 3 people full-time just managing the revenues that they actually get from the provincial government to deliver programs. So that's a problem. The other thing we've heard in many cases is that we're measuring the wrong things. And I know that there's been discussion about how do you measure things, and one of the things we're trying to figure out is the social capital that we're talking about, and it was actually an interesting presentation, is it's very difficult for people who follow the numbers to actually recognize the upfront costs that you actually, if you put in that preventative measure, that you can actually track the dollars and cents and that you're not spending them over there. But because of the way the funding works, it's not actually connecting A to B. So we have to figure out how to do a better job of basically tracking, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and the cost benefits, and therefore pay for something up front to avoid paying for it down the road. That's not an easy conversation. It's not the way that programs are often developed, and it's certainly not a way that we've measured them in the past. So that whole service component is really challenging. Then we've worked with some of the, I say I'm working both inside government and outside government. I hear what the outside of government says, and then I work with the inside government to say, okay, how are we going to fix that? And there's a lot of things that they've heard before that they're actually trying to fix, and this just might give them a focus for making that happen. So once the service plan is figured out and the communities have decided what they need to do, probably a lot of the next step is to figure out where do you do that? Where do you provide those services? What is the physical space? Or in some case, what is the virtual environment in which we now want to operate? So that leads you to the question which we get into fairly quickly around schools and the fact that there's a strategy around schools. And we've heard loud and clear that perhaps selling schools the way we're currently selling schools and selling public property generally is really perhaps not the longest term vision that we should be taking to these assets. So again, that's a conversation that actually has probably been going on for a long time, but people have been going down a path, and we now are trying to figure out, so how do we do that in a way that makes sense? How do we actually look at these assets in a much more of a life cycle type approach? You may not need a school today, but you actually may need housing, you may need seniors for a while, and actually you might need a school eventually down the road. But we know that capital asset that we have is a finite quantity. So, and I have to say, coming from Toronto, and I do apologize that for the, sometimes, but you could sell every piece of property to a condo developer and make a lot of money. But we're missing out on a whole conversation about what is the value to the community and how do you actually measure the fact that we built all these condos, but actually we don't have anywhere to play and we don't have a park and we don't have a school. So that makes it a little bit of a tricky balancing act. So as I mentioned, we're trying to figure out that physical space that will then allow you to provide the things that you need in a community, and what does that look like? And the other thing we've really noticed is there really is, in some ways, a gap in planning. And there's a gap sometimes at the community level in terms of bringing together all of the partners that need to be at a table to figure out how to bring those partnerships together. And we know it's hard work. It's much harder work to actually work in a partnership arrangement than it is to do your own thing and just get to the finish line. It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of working with other people, which sometimes makes life difficult. But there's also a gap at the provincial level, which we've recognized, which is we need to make sure that actually, as we're looking at the planning that goes on in the Ministry of Health, for example, and we've got community health centers, and we're trying to figure out a strategy which actually delivers community-based servicing, there needs to be a conversation at a local table to figure out how those pieces fit together. And right now, in certain places it works really well, and in a lot of places it doesn't work well at all. So we're trying to figure out what is it that would actually change that conversation to be much more integrated planning, both at the local level and at the provincial level, and how we can bring those two planning tables much closer together. The other thing that is interesting, and I noticed it when I mentioned that everybody found me and wanted to talk about community hubs, is there really is a governance vacuum. And perhaps at the province and maybe perhaps at the community level, which is, how does this work now in government? How does this work in a community level that we're really changing the way we're trying to make people work together for the common outcomes? So the way the provincial government is set up is structurally in ministries. It's in silos. And there's a real desire to think we need to think outside the box, but we need to figure out what are those mechanisms that we can do to actually incite that behavior so that there's actually some mechanism that allows that type of cooperation and integration in the planning. And that, as I say, moving the mothership to try and think differently about how they plan our communities is the kind of thing that we've been talking about, because community hubs has just become a really interesting planning tool to do what government is trying to do and is very difficult for us to do. So the challenge that we've thrown to the community at large is to say, you guys have been working on the ground, you've been building new neighborhoods, you've been working on community development, and there's probably points of intersection you would say, if only the province had done this, or why are they not here, or what is it that, your advice to us as we try and figure out what our action items are for the Premier. I also would remind people we are not trying to solve all the world's problems, although at times it feels like that, but we are trying to sort of put together for the Premier and for the province a bit of an action plan that says, if we take these first steps, we're going to have this is the start of a conversation. We need to figure out what those first steps are that will actually start moving those planning tables together, that will start working on those more of an integrated service delivery and change the way we measure our outcomes so that we can actually, if we're trying to have a healthier population base, then we should be measuring what we're doing to make sure that we're getting where we need to go. So we have a number of questions, and I know we have a little workshop later this afternoon, because what we're really asking people is, don't tell us this doesn't work. There's a number of people who have said, that policy is just, it doesn't work. Well, that's fine, but you need to tell us how you'd fix it. So we're trying to get people to think, help us, because I would say we don't have the path forward without your help, and we're trying to get a sense of, there's some things that we think we can do in the short term that are probably some of the low-hanging fruit that we can actually start moving things in that direction. There's some things in the medium term. We haven't really defined that. It's sort of an organic process. It's evolving as we go. And then there's some long-term things that are going to be a real challenge in terms of how we deliver, on some of the things that we want to change. But we're trying to sort of lay that out, which will then take place over the next years as we figure out how do we keep moving in partnership with our local communities and not for a second think that our job is at that level. You guys know that world. You need to be able to operate in that world with some of the maybe strings that have been removed from you. So that's sort of our goal. that's our timeline, which is feeling very short right now. And we're looking forward to getting your feedback and any advice that you might have that we can actually build into our action plan as we go forward. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to tell you where we're going. Thank you very much.